guys in the dark.
This happened about 16 years ago. I was in summer camp for my Boy Scout troop. They both had boys and girls. One of the most important activities that we had during camp was what was called raid. It was going out of the camp to adventurously trek for a couple of days. My friends and I had an amazing route that went through a beautiful mountain range out here in the northeast of Spain. We had 3 days walking, 2 nights of sleeping out of the camp. My group consisted of 15 boys and girls, all between 12 and 14 years old. We had taken food with us. We knew how to read a map, how to build a shelter. We even knew how to search for water. Pretty much anything that we needed to survive for just a couple of days. No adults were coming with us. The first day, we were to climb the mountain. It was just under 3,000 meters, and sleep by a lake nearly on top of it. It was a very long walk from our camp. It was about 17 miles, and it was steep. So we decided that about 1800, we were not going to reach the lake at a proper time. We spotted a nice place to go and build a shelter. We did it, and then cooked us some dinner. We were in the middle of a beautiful mountain. It was about 8 miles from the nearest road. We really couldn't have been happier. We had 2 hours until sunset when we had finished our meal, so we thought that it was a good idea to send a smaller group to go clean dishes, fill up water by a spring that we had seen while we were walking. I volunteered, and 3 other friends to join. We got a couple of torches, just in case, headed towards the fountain. Nighttime had come while we were on our way back to the shelter. We could hear the rest of the group singing, having fun in the distance. Suddenly, one of my friends stopped, pointed at something just by the side of our trail. Something that wasn't there on our way down. I'm pretty sure it wasn't, one of my friends had said. There was a light reflecting pole from the road that was torn into pieces. We went from being happy and relaxed to being scared in just a few seconds. Rushed all the way to where the rest of the friends were. We told them about the creepy finding right away. Our fear had escalated very fast. Who would be hiding in the same mountain that we were? Why? 2 of the older guys that were about 14 years old decided it would be a good idea to go and take a look around, just to try and calm us down. Being without them was much scarier. We also appreciated it, though. They went away with a torch, a knife, and a whistle. We remained inside the shelter, which was nothing more than a couple of tarps held by sticks near a giant boulder. We were silent and scared. I remember hearing quite a lot of sobbing around me. I was thinking that I didn't want to die here. One of the girls suggested that we should try to sing, or think of something else to try to ease our fear. Some of them disapproved, because we might not hear the whistling, but we did anyways. Not very loud, though. We did that for about 30 minutes. The whistle had interrupted our singing. We heard it very clearly. 2 whistles coming towards us at a very fast pace. I remember taking my knife and keeping it in my hands. Luckily, it was our friends. They had arrived, very nervous and exhausted from running. They told us that they came across a long stick that was standing with lots of blood all over it, more than what our nerves could stand. Most of us had started crying. Some of us had prayed. They told us that they were going to look for whoever was in the mountain with us, confront them, just in case things go bad. We'll run somewhere else so that he can't find you, one had said. We asked them to stay. Nobody was able to move a finger to stop them from leaving the tent. There was no more singing, just crying, barely audible prayers. I didn't want to die there. I just wanted to go see my family. After a while, we had heard some noises, followed by the voices of our friends. They came back at a very calm pace. Relief was in their faces. It was all just a misunderstanding, one had told us. It's a park ranger. We found him. He was just walking around as part of his duty. The bloody stick happened to be from a rabbit that he had hunted for dinner. It was a relief, so we all relaxed. Someone spoke about taking our sleeping bags out and going to sleep. That sounded great to us. It wasn't very long before one of the older guys said that he was a bit suspicious of everything. He wasn't wearing a uniform, he said, nor a badge, or anything that would identify him as a park ranger. And who walks kilometers away from the closest road, late at night, to go hunt rabbits? Are there even rabbits in this forest? Terror had come back in just mere seconds. They were right. That story didn't make any sense to anybody. One of the older kids had said we should go kill him. We had asked him to stay with us. We got the same result. Once he was gone, someone said maybe they had followed them, and now they know where we are. Panic had grew over all of us. Nobody was paying the slightest attention to anybody else. Nobody had cried, and nobody was praying. I had one thought. I'd rather kill than get killed in this place. We sat there waiting, silent, and ready to fight for our lives. We all had our knives out and was ready, just in case. Some time had passed. We suddenly hear people running, approaching us. We heard screams of terror. It sounded like there were more than two people coming at us. I hadn't been more scared in my life. I hoped that I could say goodbye to my mom and my dad. My knife was ready to stab whoever had come close to me. We saw our two friends, running for their lives, being followed by two men. They came at the opening of the shelter, and then stopped. The two men chasing them did the exact same thing. We could see their faces. They were our camp leaders, who had followed us the entire time, but they were hiding. The four started laughing at us, asking if we were scared. It was just a joke, all the time. Everyone started crying suddenly. Some even had problems to gasp for proper breaths, due to the anxiety. We were not amused at all. After a few minutes, the funny four realized that they had done really bad. They took 14 children to the point of holding a knife and being willing to kill with it. We relaxed a lot, but our fear became anger. It had been a joke way out of proportion, or the most basic common sense. They spent a while telling us how sorry they were. We really didn't care. We wanted them to leave us alone. On the other hand, we're still too scared to sleep on our own. We accepted that they came to sleep with us. It took them months to regain our trust. That was the worst night of my life, no doubt. I've never had nightmares about it. I remember it like it was yesterday. Since I'm older now, I think what could have happened if two guys had been there to actually kill us. We were just children, true, but armed, and at the final moments, willing to kill anything. We could have chopped them into many pieces. I really cannot think of what the headlines would be. Two murderers stabbed to death in the mountains by children. Autopsy reveals more than 300 lethal wounds in each one of the corpses. I had climbed Mount Fitzroy. That happens to be in Argentina. Everybody that I knew said that it was safe to do it by myself. The day started with beautiful weather. I could follow the signs, meet quite a few people on the road. Suddenly, the weather had changed. Everything went dark. I couldn't see my hand right in front of my eyes. I was lost. I decided to find my way back down to the village. The only thing I remembered was that I had crossed a little river. I walked towards the sound of water. I found it, but it had risen so much that you couldn't cross it. I knew that I had to try, though, so I looked for big stones to throw in, tried to hold myself as I had crossed. I almost lost my life. Thankfully, I only lost my watch and my backpack. I had reached the other side. I was completely wet and trembling. I still couldn't see anything. There was no path in front of me. I had been crying and shouting for help for almost an hour. Finally, in the distance, I could hear a voice. A Swiss couple had guided me back. Once I was safe, I heard an Argentine man and an American tourist were missing as well. Later, they had found their dead bodies.
This happened a long time ago, when a pack of cigarettes and a gallon of gas are worth less than $1, and it only costs a dime to use a payphone. It was a time when hitchhiking across town was okay, with the occasional warnings from older folks that Ted Bundy may be our next ride. I was 17 at the time, worked at a fast food joint in the valley along with two of my friends, Dottie and Jolene. We all dreamed of taking a trip together, and how much fun we would have hitchhiking up the coast of California just to see where we ended up. One day, the place we worked at got robbed. The detective said most likely it was an inside job, so we all had to take a lie detector test, of course. We all passed, but the owner fired everybody and started over. Years later, we found out that it was his own son. Anyways, we all got paid our 2 checks, and we thought that we were rich. This was our opportunity. We didn't think Jolene was serious because her parents were rich, and she had everything. Why would she want to leave all that while we were both staying in a friend's garage? With absolutely nothing to lose. But she surprised us and said she was all in. We started out early the next morning, and boy, we were excited. We didn't know what we were doing or how to get anywhere. Nevertheless, we were having fun. All day long we were singing songs and getting rides. Pretty much it was a dream come true. The first night we sat in a diner until morning, and we were at it again. We would take turns standing with our thumbs out while the others napped under a tree, but we stayed close to the towns because it felt a lot safer. Thinking back, none of this was safe. It started to get dark, and we hadn't had a ride in a while. Jolene began to miss her mom and her clean bed, but we didn't miss anything except for an umbrella because it started to rain. We didn't count on the rain. We were so tired, but we just kept on walking, hoping to get a ride. But it was looking pretty bleak until we saw this guy in an old truck. I had a bad vibe from the guy, but Jolene begged us to take his ride because her feet hurt. So we did. He was just supposed to take us to the next town, so what harm could it be? It was a bench seat, so we all piled in. Jolene jumped in first. Then Dottie, then me by the door. Dottie and I were tired because we did most of the standing that day, so we both just dozed off. We must have been out for a while when I heard Jolene make a strange sound. I cracked open my eyes and saw no streetlights. We were going very slow. I nudged Dottie, and we both looked over at Jolene. She was sitting straight up and stiff with tears streaming down her face, and this guy's arm was around her holding a knife to her neck. He was steering with his knee, and the other hand was down her pants. Just then Dottie yelled out, "Oh my God." It startled the man, so he straightened his arm, pinning Dottie's throat to the seat. While all this is happening, I started feeling in my backpack for my knife, not taking my eyes off that guy. I reached over and grabbed the stick shift, slamming it in reverse. The truck made a loud crunching sound, and we all flew into the dash, and the truck hit a guardrail, and so we jumped out. The guy hit his head pretty hard, but he started yelling at us like it was our fault. I noticed that he had on a wedding ring. At that point, the girls were both screaming to go, but I just had to. I jumped back up into his truck and took his little knife that I found laying on the seat, stabbed him right in his junk. Of course he tried to hit me while calling me names, but I showed him my big knife and said while I was crawling out, "Explain that to your wife." He drove off, chugging and grinding down the road. We found ourselves in the middle of nowhere. We could hear the sound of his truck getting quieter as it got further away. Jolene fell to her knees and cried. We tried to comfort her, but we were all in shock. There was nothing but rolling hills and winding roads for miles, and it was still raining. The roads were only lit by a full moon, occasionally peeking through the clouds. I felt responsible for these 2 girls, and at the same time, I felt helpless. We walked for a long time at one point, even taking turns carrying Jolene. After a while, a car had passed us. I was so tired I forgot to put out my thumb. Dottie got mad at me for letting it pass. But it then stopped not too far ahead of us and sat there for a minute while we were still walking. Dottie asked what I thought I was doing. I didn't have a clue, so we approached it slowly. Jolene saw that it was a man and started to walk backwards, saying no, no, no. I didn't blame her. Plus we were all pretty freaked out by the last guy. He was a nicely dressed man in a Cadillac. He asked what the heck we were doing out here in the rain. We told him what had just happened, and he promised us that he wasn't a creep. He told us that we could all sit together in the back, and that he wouldn't mind taking us to the next town to get us something warm to eat. It was our only choice, so we went with him. He ended up taking us to a coffee shop, and the waitress gave us some towels to dry off. He seemed nice enough. He said that he was a successful music artist, and wrote him music for big movies. He then told me some of his work, and I knew it well, seeing that my sister was a theater art major and practically raised me watching musicals. The phone was broken, so he told us he only lived about 45 minutes away, and he would be glad to let us use his phone and crash there for the night. Then after breakfast, he would give us a ride to wherever we needed to go. Well, I was more concerned about getting Jolene somewhere she felt safe. Remember, we were only 16 and 17 in the world for the first time. We finished up our food and got in the back of his car. Jolene slept in my lap as I stroked her hair, and Dottie sat wide-eyed the whole way there. We arrived at his house, and we were pleasantly surprised that he was telling us the truth. It was a big, beautiful 2-story mansion with a big piano and studio equipment. There was a film screen that played the movies that he was working on. He gave us some dry clothes of his. Seeing that he was short, they almost fit us. Jolene fell asleep on the couch, and we talked for a little while. It was starting to get really late, so I asked him where we were going to sleep. He told me the top of the stairs on the left. He said that we could leave our bags on the counter, and I was kind of reluctant, but too tired to even care. It was a medium-sized room with one big king-size bed that was calling my name. We shut the door, and he flew up the stairs and opened it, saying this door must stay cracked. Weird, but whatever. Dottie got up and went to the bathroom. When she came back, she shut the door. He instantly opened the door and said, "It needs to stay cracked." He stepped away, and Dottie got real close to me in the bed and whispered in my ear, "He's standing in the hall." I asked her what she meant, and she said he is just standing in one spot, twirling his mustache, staring at our door. Just then, Jolene sat straight up, then jumped out of the bed, saying she was going to be sick. She ran out of the room to the bathroom, and then the door slammed shut. Waiting for her to come back, we started to worry. I got up and went to the door, but it was locked. We banged on the door, but we didn't hear anything. We started to look around the room for something to open it, but the room was bare. We tried to listen to see if we heard our friend, but we didn't hear anything. Now Dottie is starting to cry. And believe me, I wanted to cry too. An hour or so had passed, and we hear a car pull up. We can't see the car from the room, but just as soon as it came, it left. Then we heard him come up the stairs. He opened up the door and said, "I said leave it open." We both bombarded him with questions as to where our friend was and what did he do with her. He just looked at us and laughed. He told us that she called her mother, and she picked her up. That she was pretty mad at us. He said that it was funny. That didn't explain why we were locked in there, but he said that we were mistaken. The door was probably jammed, and just to try to get some sleep, and then he left the room, cracking the door. We were pretty scared. Dottie and I just laid there waiting for the morning. I told her the first thing we do is get our bags and run. She agreed, but then he came in. He stood there looking at us. We didn't know what he was going to do, and my knife was downstairs in my bag. He stood up on the bed and told us to move over so that he could lay down. We both reluctantly moved. He took off his pants, leaving only his underwear on, threw them across the room, and plopped down between us. He told us to get closer to him. Dottie started to shake, and all these things were going through my head on how to get out of this. Then it hit me. An old movie I watched with my sister where there was a similar situation, and the girl started to laugh at this gangster who was coming at her. She started to make fun of his size, so he stopped. He ended up punching her, but he stopped. So that's what I did. I started to laugh and make fun of him. Dottie looked at me like I was insane, but it was seeming to work, so she joined in. He started to cry and say weird things like he was a bad boy. Oh my gosh, we were so scared, while his eyes were covered by his hands. I nodded to Dottie, and we both jumped up and ran out. I slammed his door, and we ran downstairs grabbing our bags while running to the door. But it was locked, so we ran to the back of the house and out the sliding door by the pool. We saw that he was coming down the stairs. Dottie had screamed, "Where do we go?" We both threw our bags over the back wall and jumped. We didn't know he lived on a steep hill, so we both rolled down almost to the street below. Both of us were cut and scraped, but we made it to a payphone. Still having doubts, Jolene made it out alive. We called her mother. Thankfully, Jolene was home, safe and sound. But she never knew when she left to tell anyone we were in trouble. We called a friend, and he came all the way out there and picked us up. We never called the police because we figured he was a big shot. We didn't think anyone would believe us at the time. Besides, we couldn't find his house again if you paid us. But I will tell you one thing. We never hitchhiked ever again. To understand the magnitude of this story, you must know who I am. Here's a little backstory. I was born in 1954, so the formidable years were spent growing up under the influence of the 60s and early 70s in a small town in upstate Ohio. When I say small, I mean one light at Broadway in Maine. There were about 40 businesses in the center of town. The drugstore soda shop was right on one of those corners. There was also the hardware store, small grocery store, Ben Franklin's, a gas station, barber shop, stuff like that. We had Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, and Catholic churches, and most everyone went to one of them weekly. You get the picture. It was Mayberry. We also had a library, a post office, and a jail. The jail was set up so that you could easily sneak right past the cop desk 9 times out of 10 to go see if anyone was in jail. If there was, we would run errands for them, go get cigarettes, whatever. We never bothered to ask, "What are you in for?" I was a curious, free-spirited, and completely wild and innocent child. A little bit later came the assassination of JFK, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam protests, and the hippie revolution, which I joined in, becoming one of the earliest hippies. So maybe you can now guess where this story is leading. Hitchhiking was a commonplace in those years, so I did it a lot. For a little over 3 years, I made many trips all over the United States and Canada, much to the dismay of my mother. Sometimes I would take my friends. Sometimes I went alone, always with no money, no clothing, and no worries. So many people tried to warn me of the dangers, but being very young and naive, and feeling quite invincible, I ignored all of their well-meaning advice. This wasn't my first trip, nor was it my last, but it was the most memorable, and you'll now understand the gravity of the very close call that it was. It was June 1969. I was 14. I was spending the night with my friend, Deanna, who lived in a neighboring mirrored town. I talked her into coming with me to San Francisco. She just happened to have a brother living out there that she had not seen in a while. So we headed there across the cow pasture to the highway and stuck out our thumbs. It didn't take very long to get a ride, as you can probably imagine. We received many rides. A band tour bus picked us up on their way to a gig in Chicago, but we didn't want to make that big of a detour, so we passed it up. I can't remember who the band was. I remember another ride when we got into a convertible Cadillac with 4 black men and went to a party in Blacktown, Columbus, Ohio. We were the only white people at this party, and let me tell you, we had a blast. I never felt unwanted or in danger. In fact, the nice lady that lived in that apartment gave me a shirt, which I thought was so kind. Now as an adult, I realized she was trying to cover me up. God bless her. The next ride was pretty cool, until he picked up another hitchhike. A lone guy who kept nagging him about how much trouble he was going to be in if he got caught taking these 2 underage girls across state lines. He became very agitated and told him to just shut up. We should have gotten out right then and there, but we decided to stay. He wasn't dangerous, just annoying. Well, the driver had stopped for gas in Iowa, and Deanna and I went to the restroom to freshen up. When we came out, the cops were waiting for us. We ended up in the Iowa jail. I'm sure that our parents were contacted immediately, although I do not recall this. We were quite the attraction in this little jail. The cops would come up and talk to us, play some cards. They would bring us cigarettes, candy, and donuts. I don't think we were there for too long before Deanna's mom had driven out to pick us up, and after a conversation with her daughter, she decided to drive us the rest of the way to California. That's just over 1,900 miles. I remember singing to the radio all the way to Nevada. I especially remember the mamas and the papas. Are you going to San Francisco? Later we booked into a hotel in Reno. This is not what I signed up for. I tried to talk Deanna into taking off. I realize now, as an adult, what a terrible, selfish act that would have been, and how devastating that could have been to her mom. Luckily for everyone, she refused to do that, so I just stayed. We finally ended up in San Francisco, right at the Height, and Ashbury near Berkeley College, where all the hippie action was. It was all so overwhelming to me. It was pretty cool for our little town, but this stuff is way out of my league. I did mention how naive I was. I was not fully aware of things like drug addiction, but I figured it out firsthand at Needle Park. Seeing everyone strung out on drugs scared me to death. I saw other things too that I cannot mention. Needless to say, I was shocked. I wanted to go home, and I have never wanted to go back to California again. And I have never been back to it this day. I don't remember how many weeks I was gone on that particular adventure, but shortly thereafter, I was home watching TV with my mom. It was July, and it was all over the news about the Manson family and the infamous murders. I then realized how close I had come to being picked up by them and possibly becoming one of the family. What if I would have taken off on my own looking for adventure and had not stayed with Deanna and her mom that night, hitchhiking alone through the desert, 9 hours away from Spawn Ranch? What if that guy had not turned us into the cops in Iowa, and we would have been out there, just the two of us? Most assuredly, I or both of us would have gotten picked up by one of them. Later, I found out that the family were recruiting people from Haight and Ashbury, and also how irked I was because we couldn't lose her mom. Every day I'm thankful that I did not get caught up in that. I was sure ripe for the picking, especially if they would have gotten a hold of me before I made it all the way to California. In all of my adventures, I was never beat up, raped, or murdered. I really did believe that I was under divine protection.
A few years ago, I was stressed out from college. So I decided to spend a long weekend in the woods and doing what my city friends would consider lunacy, but us outdoorsy people would consider heaven. Deep woods, free camping, in the winter, by myself. Yes, this does sound like the beginning of a missing persons report, but if you are an experienced outdoorsman, it is really safe. I always took a secret pleasure in being the warrior that my dad always hoped that I would be. I hated the feeling of claustrophobia that would come with being female in the big city. You know, avoiding the eye contact, not walking alone at night. When you're a female alone out in the woods, you are in charge. You're safe, or so I thought. I was on the road for a few hours. The surroundings were getting wilder as I had drove. I parked in an allowed roadside ditch with a compass and my map. I hiked until I was in a mile's reach or so of some good ice fishing. I was about 5 or 6 miles from the road. I made a discreet camp in the middle of the clearing, with just one little hole in the snow for my tiny tent and my tiny campfire. After a few beautiful days of just hiking and relaxing around the camp, I had made the trek to the fishing hole. Everything was winter stillness. The air was clean. The only signs that I wasn't in a perfect vacuum were the twitterings of birds, the distant rumblings of the waterfalls. After a mile or so of crunching along in the snow, I had celebrated by punching a hole in the thin ice and set up so I can get my fishing on. My first catch was pretty quick. After a few weeks under a frozen surface, fish are pretty hungry. I was feeling fatigued and very jumpy. I decided to just clean the fish here and take it straight back to the camp to cook. I soon realized that my fishing skills were rusty. I cursed my lack of preparation as I had cut myself for the second time. Something in my peripheral was irritating me. I was set on my task, though, focusing on the motions and the slippery mess. Whatever was in my view was growing more irritating, like the buzzing of a fly. I carved and hacked, sliced my hand open, freshly as the fish had slipped out of my hands and onto the snow. I was frustrated. After yelling a bunch of curse words, silence had resumed. My heart had stopped. Living in a college neighborhood, I'd grown so accustomed to white noise, I had failed to recognize how grossly inappropriate this sound was in this context. The silence had weighed down on me when I suddenly broke into a sweat. The only reason anyone would be in this deep of the woods would be to hunt. No hunter would give himself away like that. Suddenly I heard whistling. Well, I thought, if he was whistling for any other reason, shouldn't he have reacted from my outburst? Possibly yelled something back, maybe even apologized to me. Nothing at all. Just stillness of the woods. Suddenly I wasn't sure if I had misheard the twittering of a bird. I just decided that the fish was a lost cause. I had slung my gear over my shoulder and decided to head back for camp. I trudged off in the woods, about a quarter mile from camp, saw a large mass protruding from the snow. Like a moth to a flame, I trudged up to what materialized in a closing distance as a moose. Like a really good moose kill. Clean shot, through an upturned eye, staring directly at me. It was just staring directly at me, saying something. Saying something that was imposing a sense of dread on me, but a dread that I couldn't translate. I ran as fast as I could, in the snow and in the woods. Everything just looked the same to me. All I knew is I was heading south. I knew that I would pass the camp on the east. I made for the road. Eventually I was slowing down to a weary trudge, calming at the comforting sight of the woods clearing right ahead of me. That would make way for the country road. I had looked to my left, saw my car about 60 yards or so down the road. I jogged to it. Drove the lonely 15 miles to the first hotel that I saw signs for. I didn't grab any of my belongings, and I had no earthly idea why I had just abandoned ship like that. When I was sitting up watching infomercials, everything started to fall together. Why would the Park Service issue free camp passes for the same stretch of woods that they had allowed hunting for? That moose had defied everything. Even with the snow to cool it, decomposing starts quickly on an animal that size. You would have time for possibly a few pictures, but you would want to dress it quickly. Why would you kill a moose 5 miles into the forest? How would you drag it back to the road? In the morning, I had told the park ranger everything that I had seen and heard, even though I happened to be sleep-deprived and paranoid. He seemed vexed about the illegal hunting, more so than the crazy city girl ramblings. He told me that he wanted to pick me up, have me take him to where I thought the kill site was. I told him that that was possible, but he would have to bring a gun. He had sighed, and then told me where to meet him. We had rode out into the woods on an ATV, with me awkwardly riding on the back. We got to a large impression in the snow, exactly where that moose had been. Blood was everywhere. There was also the distinct track of the carcass being dragged. The drag marks made a smooth trail right into the snow, as if the carcass were on a trap. That ranger said he could take me back now. He asked where my camp happened to be. I pointed in the direction of the drag marks. Looked like he was finally sharing in my uneasiness. When I got back at the hotel, I had washed my clothes in the sink and got ready to drive home in the morning. Unknown number had called my phone. It happened to be that park ranger. The moose had been dragged to my campsite. He described the scene as a really big mess. He wasn't sure if an animal had helped to make the mess, but one thing definitely was clear. Someone cut into my tent with a knife. I had asked him about all the other belongings that I had. He said, "You really don't want them back. They're covered in moose blood." "Well, what happens now?" I had asked him. "Well, miss, we're just going to keep an eye out for this dude. I haven't heard or seen anything like this before. I'm really sorry that this has happened to you." That was the end of it. There was no closure, no explanation. In the years that have passed, I've tried every different application of reasoning that I can think of. A hunter who needed help, but knew that I was already gone. Deranged psychopath looking to make his second kill. One of the few friends I shared the story with envisioned him as some deep woods Sweeney Todd, dubbed him Moosey Todd. One question has been answered for me. Will I ever go back into those woods? The answer is, never again will I go back there alone. My girlfriend and I were looking for something fun to do. We had stumbled upon an online event, scheduled for the next weekend. A hike through a forest that climbed into a mountain range. Naturally, we had jumped for joy and plunged ahead first into this new adventure. The day of the departure came soon enough. We were ready. Boots, sandwiches, and everything. First, we had to wait for our ride. 2 sandwiches worth of waiting until the car had arrived. We got into the car and got going. The weather was sunny, clear, almost warm. Then our luck started to waver. As time had marched on, the weather started getting colder in spite of the shining sun. During the last stretches of actual road, the car had gone in and out of patches of dense fog. To get to where we needed to go, the car then had to go off-road for the remainder of the ride. Right before it had stopped, we passed through an area that lacked in grass, or shrubbery of any kind. All the autumn leaves that had fallen were free to blanket the ground completely. Strangely, the trees that no one would think possible for the fallen leaves seemed to be missing none, and as such, offering a picture seen only in works of fantasy, like the golden leaves strewn across the ground, but also filling the branches up above. The car had stopped. Our destination was reached. Ahead of us was the mountain. Its right side was bathed in sunlight, while its left was covered in shadow, and a dense fog was crawling towards it. As mountains go, the Manson Mountain are some of the shortest. We stepped out of the car, walked a little way along a dirt road until we had reached the gate that marked both the starting and the end point of the hiking trails. The gate was locked shut with a thick chain and a rusted lock. Clearly this gate had been closed for many years, but our guide told us not to worry, because that wasn't really the path that we were going to take. Our trail was right next to the gate, where this booth and barrier were. These were also rusted and unkept. We had passed the barrier. Some ducked, while others had hopped the obstacle, and off we were. This was around noon. It really must have rained recently. The foliage was wet, and the earth happened to be damp. This made hiking slightly more difficult, but the colors nature had gained made the effort worthwhile. All the colors were just so alive, so vibrant. We followed the trail, accompanied by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Later we were surprised by a loud woodpecker. The weather kept growing colder as the sun was making its way west. When the path had become steep, we saw patches of snow where the shadow endured throughout the day. In spite of all the beauty that had been seen, we started feeling weary as we had been hiking for many hours. As we were about to suggest taking a break, the guide had intervened. He said that we had fallen behind schedule, that if we didn't cut our way over the mountain instead of following the trail around it, we would run the risk of being in the forest after sundown. So climb we did, as soon as we found an opening between the trees and the jagged rocks. Further up, we were using our hands to grab onto branches and the rocks so as not to fall off. When we reached a relatively level path of ground, one of the hikers had sounded distressed. She shouted at the guide about if there were wolves in the area or not. When he denied that there are any, she pointed to this big canine footprint next to her feet and asked what could have left that if it wasn't a wolf. To which he replied that it's just the print of a shepherd dog, then said that we should keep moving before anyone would ask what a shepherd dog would be doing all the way up here. We were climbing much faster now for some reason. 15 minutes later, we were at the summit, walking through the waist-high grass. We saw the mountain range curve ahead, while in the valley below, we could see the car right next to the ancient oak where it had been left. When we saw this wave of fog rolling in, it enveloped the car. Worried that we might get lost if the fog had reached us, we started running downhill in the direction of that car. We were going too fast for how uneven the ground was. Some of us fell. Others tried to grab a tree on their way down. In the end, dirty and bruised, we had hopped in the car and tried to put this adventure behind us. A work friend and I decided to go hiking and wild camping on Dartmoor, England, for a weekend in the summer. After hiking for around 7 hours, we were pretty exhausted, and not on the trail that we originally planned to be on, due to a navigation error. We decided to best pitch up now, as it was getting dark, rather than try and make our way back to our original route in the dark. We found a flat area just down a bank next to a small stream. Decided there was as good as any spot. We had separate tents. I placed mine with the entrance facing the bank. Dartmoor National Park is full of sheep roaming free. After pitching up and eating, I went to relieve myself, so I had walked away to be far from the river. On my way back, I had spotted a ram's skull. Not uncommon, but I thought that it was cool, so I decided to pick it up to bring it back. Only when I picked it up did I realize that there were at least another 10 skulls scattered around, which made me feel like I came across a sheep graveyard. I took the skull back to the camp, placed it right outside of my tent. We got in our own tents and tried to get some sleep. I didn't get much, as I could hear the river running, and the noise kept disturbing me. I was lying awake when I heard a big splash in the river, like someone throwing a big stone. not like someone wading through or walking. I called out to my friend to find out if it was her, but I had gotten no reply. I figured that she was asleep, so I decided to open up my tent to go check. I unzipped the door, and there stood on top of the bank was a huge ram. It just stood there, staring directly at me. I thought maybe I had startled it, so I froze. I didn't hear it approach, and it couldn't be what had splashed, as the river was behind my tent, and I'm sure that I would have heard it clamber up the bank. I got out to turn and check the river. There was nothing there. I flashed my torch over my friend's tent. It was undisturbed. All the time the ram just stood, staring directly at me. It didn't move or run when I got out of my tent. They usually do if you approach. I got back into my tent, left the door open a little while. The ram still stood there, just watching me. I eventually had closed up and tried to sleep, all the while trying to hear the ram move on. I didn't sleep much that night, and as soon as the sun had rose, I decided to get up and go relieve myself. I was shocked and felt all the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end when I saw the ram was still just standing there. It was daylight, and it must have stood there for like 6 hours, just staring at me. I had decided that I'd have enough and climbed the bank to shoo it off, but instead of running it, Bluff charged me, which threw me off guard a little bit. Adrenaline was pumping, and groggy from just getting up. I shouted real serious, like an angry dad, "Hey, get!" And it froze. We had a staring contest for a good 30 seconds, but felt much longer than that, before I had stomped forward and scared it off. My friend had came out of her tent, asked me what was going on. I explained everything. She obviously thought that I was joking, or trying to scare her, because she told me that she didn't get much sleep, as she was text arguing with her boyfriend most of the night, and didn't hear anything. Didn't hear the splash, me getting out of my tent and shining the light on her, or any kind of sheep. We packed up and headed downriver towards the original trail that we went on, where we found 2 dead sheep on the riverbank. I didn't exactly thoroughly investigate, but it was obvious that they hadn't been there for very long. We headed off and finished our trip with nothing else going on. Maybe we stumbled across the beast of Dartmoor's hunting ground, and the ram had tried to warn us. Or maybe it was a demon ram come to seek revenge for removing that skull. Some weird stuff does go down on Dartmoor, and some weird things have gone on through my head. Back in the day, when I was in college, me and my oldest had taken off to a lake in the wilds of Glacier Country. I have extensive backcountry exposure, even did a stint as a big game guide in a remote backcountry camp. On this day, we had enjoyed the fishing and settled in for the night. I pulled out my pan and stoked up a nice fire. It was clear and cool as the sun had faded into the western slopes. We cooked up some fresh rainbows with garlic and butter and filled our stomachs. I leaned back against the cooler after pulling out a refreshing beverage. The boy was soon asleep by the fire, as it had been a very busy day. I had sipped my beer and watched the moonlight bouncing off the little waves in the lake. There was still a light glow on the western horizon where the sun had gone down. I could see the outline of the mountain peaks towering over the little lake. I slowly faded off to sleep with the sound of the lake waving gently, lapping on the rocks. I awoke with a start. The fire was out. The lantern was out too. The moon was gone, and it was pitch black outside. Something was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck had stood straight out. I was paralyzed. I couldn't hear my heart thumping as I strained to hear something in the bushes. All was quiet. I had a horrible, uneasy feeling. I gathered myself together and started kicking around the fire. A small flame came alive. I quickly threw on some wood. In the firelight, I could see that the boy had awoke and was shocked to see his wide-open eyes staring directly at me. "What's wrong?" he had asked. "Nothing. Go climb into the tent," I lied to him. He crawled into the tent, but even in the light of fire, I couldn't shake off my weariness. Something was out there in the bush, and I could feel it was watching me. I gathered up my light and flashed around the camp. Nothing. Finally, I began to calm down and crawled into the tent with the boy. Then again, like clockwork, I awoke completely tensed up. This time I couldn't shake the feeling at all. I finally instructed the boy to wake up and to go get in the truck. I packed up all of the camp and drove around to the other side of the lake and slept with him in that truck. At dawn, I had gotten up, looked across the lake to where we were camped earlier, and another uneasy feeling had came over me. I decided that it was time to go home. I don't know what was out there or what was going on over there, but I know my instincts, and something bad was wrong with that place. Whatever it was, I will leave it to your imagination. It just creeps me out to this day thinking about that night. I'd grown up in a small coal town in the Appalachian Mountains, on the side of one of the mountains that borders the valley of the town. It was a wonderful place, especially for a kid who was outdoorsy. We had no neighbors and acres of wood to just play in. From our house, there happened to be a dirt road that wound up the mountainside to the top of the ridge, where there stood the remains of a burnt-down cabin. We would follow the ridge to a flat area, popular with Dad's hunting friends, one of whom had posted a trail cam during the off-season so he could monitor all the wildlife out there. From there, you can continue up the ridge to a clearing that had hosted lots of flat boulders, giant electrical tower that was fun to climb on. I would venture there many times with my family and their black lab, spend hours just reading, climbing, and enjoying nature altogether. One fall, I was around 14. I went up there with a backpack full of my snacks and a book. I'd taken care to avoid the trail cams, as it was the old film variety. I'd gotten in trouble for filling entire rolls of film, just goofing off in the areas where it was posted. I had reached my favorite rock at the edge of the clearing, near some power lines. I had settled down to read, when Felicia, our dog, had started to bark and growl aggressively. Originally I'd paid no mind, as she just loved to chase deer. This time she didn't bound off into the woods. Instead she had stuck right next to me, growling at something that I couldn't see in the thick tangle of brush and trees on the mountainside that had faced the bank. Now I had considered hiking down that way, into the park on occasion. It wasn't a very easy passage, though. The area had been cleared years before, so they could install that electrical tower, and its place had grown a thick mass of briars and many weeds. The rocks that made for climbing at the top of the ridge were very difficult obstacles on the steep slopes. Not to mention, there was much easier access closer to the park entrance. This way had brought you down to an undeveloped area at the very back of the campgrounds that wasn't accessible to cars or hikers. I was taken off guard to see a man fighting his way through that brush from that exact direction. I called out hello, being very nervous. I had gripped my dog's collar. She had a tendency to jump on people when she got excited. I really didn't want her to tumble him down that mountain. The man had smiled, extracted himself from the thorns, made his way up to the hill, to the base of my rock. I didn't know if it was Felicia's reaction to him, or the rather remote and impassable way that he had come up from. His presence had made him very uneasy. He seemed pretty normal and friendly enough. He was probably about in his late 20s, average height, build. Pretty unremarkable looking, no backpack or even supplies. He was dressed as a hiker would be. I didn't like the way that he had looked at me, although at my young age, I really didn't know why it had unsettled me. As a grown woman, I looked back. I realized he was sizing me up. From his smile, he seemed to be pleased with what he had seen. "Hi, where do you come from?" He had no trace of an accent. That had struck as odd. Our area was pretty strong with regional accents. We don't get a lot of outsiders here. I lived just down the hill. I was hiking with my dog. She seems like a nice dog, he had told me, with a trace of irony. She was snarling and vibrating with malice, but he seemed very unconcerned by any of this. "You have her on a leash, though? Wouldn't want to get you in trouble with the park." "We put her on the leash when we're down in the park, but this place is our property." I didn't get a reaction to him learning this. "Still, you're so close. You don't know who might just run up here. No one from the park ever comes up here." At this point, I was being really rude with him. I was annoyed that someone was telling me what to do with my dog, on my own property. "I'm from the park," he said, still grinning at me. "I'm one of the rangers. I wanted to see the property. What would you have done if she had attacked me? You could get into huge trouble." I was really chill at this. We only had one ranger, and he was a close friend of the family. This guy was not him, though. I was afraid to let on that I knew that he was lying to me. I dug out her leash, clipped her, and then stood up, slinging on my backpack. "Sorry, we'll let you get on with your hike. I have to go get home." "Does your family know you're up here?" "Yeah, they expect me home real soon." "Does your dad come here often?" "Yeah, he comes up here to check our trail cams." This was the first time that I saw the friendly stranger's smile falter. "Trail cams, you say?" "Yeah, there's tons of them up here. He and his friends like to go hiking and hunt." The smile returned. It was cold this time. Well, these would make excellent hunting grounds. He had taken a step towards me, and the dog had lunged, nearly yanking the leash out of my hands. I managed to put her back in time to keep her from tearing this man's smile right off of his face. He didn't flinch by her whatsoever. I dragged her away, looking back over my shoulder every so often. He remained motionless in the spot where I had left him, staring right after me with the same weird smile. Once he was gone, I had picked up the pace. Felicia had growled over her shoulder quite a few times. I had heard branches snap behind me occasionally. I would glance back. I saw no signs of him following me. I had cut through the clearing with the trail cam, not bothering to avoid it in my rush to get away from the stranger. Once we had hit that road that leads home, I unclipped her from the leash, broke into a jog. She had remained by my side until I had gotten home. I didn't mention the man to any of my parents. Well, at least at first. They didn't like me hiking alone, and I didn't want them to forbid me from doing it. By the time I had gotten home, I convinced myself that I was overreacting to everything that happened. He was probably just another hiker, made up the bit about being a ranger to screw with me, since I was giving him some attitude. I didn't hike back to that ridge that week. Instead, I stuck to the woods below my house. At the end of the week, I had come home from school to an angry dad, demanding to know if I had messed with the trail cam. His buddy had came to get the film, discovered that the film had been switched off with only just a few frames taken. At first, I was concerned with just getting in trouble, and I told him that I was innocent. Then I suddenly remembered that stranger. After telling my father about him, he had called the ranger to ask if there happened to be a new ranger that we didn't know about. The ranger said no, there wasn't. But after hearing my story, he told my dad about the campground attendant that he happened to catch out of a stater overnighting in an unauthorized area back behind the campgrounds just the weekend before. He assumed that this dude was just trying to get out of paying for a camping fee. It was a young guy, he said, average looking, pretty friendly, apologized for everything, and said it was a mistake, and then he ran off. After that, we heard from my dad's buddy with the trail cam. He had gotten the roll developed. Even though there were just a few frames filled up, the last one happened to be me and my dog cutting across the clearing. Thank God I had told the stranger that there were many cams. I imagined that he would give up, since he couldn't locate the other ones. We have since moved into a snug little neighborhood down in the valley. I've moved out of town, in my parents' backyard, on the riverbank. There happens to be a mound covered by Easter lilies that mark Felicia's final resting place. The house that I had grew up in fell in disrepair after it was sold. It was eventually burnt to the ground. No one has lived on the property since. The clearing at the top is still popular with many hunters. When I'm home visiting for the holidays, I like to hike up to the ridge. I wave at all the trail cams, and I always make sure that I bring my dog with me. My name is Doc. I've been backpacking for 19 years. While my trips have nearly involved anything supernatural or creepy, I did have a scary real-world experience about 12 years ago. My best buddy growing up and I fueled each other's interest in backpacking. We grew into the hobby together, encouraged one another to do so. We were flint and steel, constantly honing one another's ability and interests, pushing each other to excel and succeed. One evening, we planned a last-minute night packing trip to his family's ranch on the Sonoma County coast. We were arriving after work, well after the sun had set. We were both eager to reach the bluffs overlooking the Pacific in time to settle in and blow off some steam from a long work week. We parked at a campsite on the lower end of the ranch. We booked it up to the old logging road up the hills. After a mile pounding the ground, we crested the first major climb and then heard a rustling in some scrub brush to our left. It was well after 2100 at this time. We were in a hurry, but wary of anything that seemed out of the ordinary. We stopped to see exactly what it was. All we saw were some dark shrubs in the moonlight. Not wanting to convey on him that I was alarmed, I passed it off to my friend that it was most likely a deer that had been spooked by us. We pressed on, climbing up into a looming grove of redwoods. The sound of movement in the brush persisted with us, pacing our progress. Every few minutes we would stop and try to see what was clearly following us. It always eluded our headlamps. Each stop was masked by some thin excuse by one or the other of us. We were desperately trying not to betray the fact that we were both alarmed. Near the end of the initial climb, the trail had turned south along the bluff, and nearly full moon shone brightly upon us. Out of the corner of my eye, I had seen movement, a brief flurry that nearly eluded me, but was seared into my mind as clearly now as the night I had seen it, the boxy and squat outline of a mountain lion. It darted for cover as fast as I could imagine, but it had been there, right beside us, for many miles. I rallied my friend, and we hustled along the past the trees into the open hillsides. As far as I could tell, our lion had led us at the tree line and let us continue our course. Shortly after that, we had made it to our planned campsite and settled down for a nice meal and a night filled with a peaceful roar of Pacific. In the early springtime. An evening never once disturbed by our companion from earlier. Years later, my buddy and I returned to the same ranch for a quiet car camping trip. After a filling meal and some nice brews, our conversation settled on that backpacking trip. Through the flickering glow of the fire, he looked directly at me and said, "You know that night we had actually been followed by a mountain lion?" Hearing him say that felt as if a weight had been lifted off of me. I told him that I know. It followed us for quite a while. I didn't want to scare you, so I tried to pass it off as a deer or some birds in the brush. He laughed and replied, "That's funny, because I didn't want to scare you either. I was really worried, but I felt that if we kept our cool, we could get through it." We laughed, poured ourselves another round. To this day, I still think about that night. All I can imagine is that the mountain lion just wasn't that interested in us. That maybe we had entered its territory, and it simply wanted us gone, and ensured this by escorting us away. We were fortunate that it had never followed us beyond the tree line, and that it had kept to itself in the shadows. I shudder to think of what the alternative could have been with that lion. This takes place in August of 2014, in the mountains of Oregon. I'm a military policeman. My girlfriend happened to be at work. It was a very hot day, and began to turn into thunderstorms. My buddy and I decided to go explore some of the back roads, get out of the heat of the town. Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively being used, many were forgotten and grown over. We had spent many of our days off starting on roads that we knew, finding many of the roads that we didn't, driving for hours into the mountains, navigating back on all the paved roads. On this one day, with storm clouds building up over the mountains, we had set up on a road we had never been on. We began the drive into the mountains. After driving for about an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods. We emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by aspen groves. This meadow was perfectly flat. It was very eerie. We both had noticed a strange stillness, just about at the same time. No birds, no insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly there were no other people around. On the far side of that meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd. However, it was painted a very bright orange, much larger than a typical picnic table in any kind of park. Remarking on this, I drove to the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we had approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The silence of the grove was unsettling. It was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as the grove has extremely close together. When we had parked at the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to go check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5". Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and really unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning that I would have to climb so I could even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, my buddy Nick had called me over to the truck. I noticed that he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I didn't see what he was looking at. Then I noticed a splash of color that was out of the place in the thick areas. A small one-man tent happened to be set up in the trees, about 60 yards or so from the strange table. I was feeling dread all of a sudden. I felt certain that there was someone in that tent, and if we could see that tent, they could definitely see us. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, no main roads for many miles. Surely someone camping so remotely would be at the very least a strange person. As we observed the tent, we didn't see any kind of movement or hear any kind of sound coming from it. Nick had suggested that I call out to it. I really didn't want to, but I decided I should. "Hey, is there anyone in there?" No reply. I was on edge at this point. Nick and I thought about driving away, just leaving the strange area behind. We began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in that tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish to think, I know. We thought it all the same. After debating, we decided to have Nick go turn the truck around so we could drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in just a hurry, he would be waiting right behind the wheel. My heart was pounding. I walked through the trees towards that tent. I was keyed up with my senses on full alert. I reached the site. Several things had struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered everywhere. No fire was ever built. No wood were collected. The tent was full of backpacks and women's clothing. I was full of dread. I had turned to leave and tell Nick what I had seen. As I left, I heard Nick start yelling at me. "Let's go! Let's get the hell out of here!" Not knowing why he was yelling at me, I had ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I leapt into the passenger seat. Nick had floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men. A third person was laying against the window in the back. As we had drove across the meadow, that driver had attempted to block us from the road. Nick had drove around them, accelerated the way that we had come from. I looked back. I saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick had drove like a madman. I honestly was terrified that they would catch us. We had hit the highway without seeing any kind of car again. I still don't know if the person in the back was male or a female. I had let the state police know. They promised to send a trooper out to go check out the scene. I received a call the very next day from a trooper, saying that the campsite, the backpacks, and the women's clothing were all gone, though he could tell people had been in that area. The table was still by the thick grove. I had not returned to the area, and I really do not intend to ever again.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.